Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Emergency Ordinance 2021 was officially gazetted yesterday. The ordinance has 18 provisions, among which stipulate that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet continue to have executive power, but also take on the function of lawmaking that was once done by Parliament. Also, that no legal action and prosecution can be brought against the government or public officials for actions they carry out during this period, and that it is an offence for any individual to defy government directives at this time. Now, do these provisions make the executive all-powerful and unaccountable? Joining us now, we have Phillip Koh, an advocate and solicitor of the High Court of Malaya. Phillip, good evening. Now, there was a lot of discussion about comparing the first bid of the emergency, which failed, to this now successful bid. Is the current emergency any different? Are essentially all declarations of emergencies in essence the same? And if not, how do they vary, Phillip?
I think it's a very important question you pose, because in the October saga, where the executive approached the Royal Highness for a proclamation, he was rebuffed, and the Rulers' Conference, or at least the members of the Rulers' Conference, issued a very interesting statement on the 25th October that said that they will not permit penyalahguna kuasa, and they would want to defend democratic norms. But fast forward now, we are in January, and the executive again approached His Royal Highness, and this time His Royal Highness is satisfied in the proclamation that there is an emergency which he was willing to proclaim under Article 150. And now we have birthed the Emergency Essential Powers Ordinance 2021. For short, I like to call it EEPO 2021. The 2021 regulations, or ordinance, has vast ramification in terms of the governance of our nation.
Phillip, can I ask you if as you pointed to that statement by the Conference of Rulers, that the issue of abuse of power, if that is the right translation for penyalahguna kuasa, does that remain a concern, especially for someone like you who looks at the Constitution?
Well, I would like to say that in modern constitutions throughout the world, there is always provisions for, of course, what we call a state of exception, or in our nomenclature, the state of emergency. This provision is found in all modern constitutions. Even Donald Trump declared a kind of emergency now for Washington, D.C. after the havoc he wrought. But insofar that there is a declaration of emergency, the article peculiar to Malaysia, 150, has been strengthened by various amendments. In particular, in 1981, the then Barisan National Government has amended in such a way that it is almost, I would say, I would not say never possible. I would say it's almost impossible to launch a challenge against the proclamation. But I would like to add, the Honorable Prime Minister, I found his statement quite interesting. He said that the civilian government should continue, and yet the ordinance suspends Parliament. Now, a civilian government does not, under the Federal Constitution, only mean the ruling executive. The opposition to is His Royal Highness opposition, His Majesty's opposition. They are part of the governance, of the constitutional governance of our country. The next question that you asked, Sharaad, I could ask. I mean, you were posing whether or not the courts could be approached to review what we call the justiciable issue. This issue is a very vexed one. In the face of the comprehensive privative clauses which exclude the jurisdiction of the courts, it would take a very robust challenge adducing evidence that this has been a wrongful use of the advice. It won't be a challenge against His Majesty's satisfaction. It will be a challenge against the executive through the cabinet advice to His Royal Highness. That
Phillip, so in these provisions of the emergency ordinance, I'm just wondering, because you brought up that phrase, the abuse of power phrase, I'm wondering whether the executive under this emergency ordinance can actually take actions that are not related to managing the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, that is what troubles citizens, because insofar the COVID provisions, I would like to touch on that actually. The wide-ranging provisions that would intrude into even property rights. I could envisage rules governing the use of private healthcare facilities. All right. The provisions suggest that once the ordinance comes out relating to that, and even in this 2021 ordinance, you will have a situation where owners or people who are in possession of assets or human resources could be directed by this ordinance to yield the use of this property to the executive government through the ordinance. Interesting for me is that because of it being passed under 150, Article 13 of the Federal Constitution, which provides for the protection of property rights, is negated or set aside. Article 13 says that if you expropriate property, you would need to pay adequate compensation. Under this provision, ordinance, the compensation is to be determined by the executive, no longer the criteria of necessary fair compensation. Now,
right,
whether a challenge...
Yeah, sorry, Phillip, if I can interrupt you, just to ask you about that independent committee that's supposed to advise the monarch on the question of whether the declaration should be rescinded earlier or take its full term. Can that independent committee be truly independent? And it gives the impression that the monarch is able to make a decision apart from the executive, or will you always have to make decisions with regard to the emergency at the behest of the executive?
Well, I find that quite interesting too, because generally speaking, it is the executive, the cabinet, that should advise the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. In this case, this independent committee, was announced and also embedded in this ordinance, suggests that there will be bipartisan members there. Now, whether or not the opposition members will take part in this committee, we shall wait to see. And at the end of the day, who has the majority or the casting vote? In the event there is a division of opinion, what happens? These are procedural issues which we should await what the Honourable Prime Minister will announce on this committee.
Right. Phillip, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us on the show. We appreciate your time tonight. We're going to take a quick break, but more on this topic in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned.
The war against COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly.
Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to be vigilant to keep ourselves and others safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and when you're out, keep a safe distance. In fighting this virus, we can't relax, so don't be lax.
No, the war against COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our look at the fine print of the emergency ordinance, which has now been officially gazetted. Joining us on the line now, we have Lim Wei Jiet. He's the Secretary General of the National Human Rights Society, or better known as HAKAM. Wei Jiet, good evening. Now, I'm going to begin by asking you a very simple question, but one that's been on my mind the past couple of days. Wei Jiet, is it treasonous to question this emergency?
No, certainly not, because under our constitutional framework, we are a constitutional monarchy, and I believe that under our constitution, whenever the Prime Minister advises the Yang Dipertuan Agong that an emergency is necessary in Malaysia, then really the Yang Dipertuan Agong doesn't really have much of discretion. So, in effect, it is the decision of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to declare the emergency. The proclamations of emergency may be issued under the name of His Majesty, but in actual reality and fact, it is the executive's decision, and hence it is not treasonous, in my view, to question the legitimacy of this emergency declaration.
Wei Jiet,
Okay, so
were the waters muddied somewhat in October when the Prime Minister went to see the monarch but didn't get that emergency declaration? At that point, it seemed like the monarch was exercising some rights under the Constitution, protecting what he believed was the national interest. So where do we go from here between this idea that it's all the executive, or in some sense, this is some grey areas involved?
Yeah, it is indeed a grey area. I mean, there are two schools of thought, even among constitutional lawyers and academics. So what happened in October was that, like you rightly pointed out, the Yang Dipertuan Agong rejected the application for an emergency. But I would still maintain, and I'm one of the persons in the school of thought who believes that we are living in a constitutional monarchy, and under our constitutional framework, the executive advises the Yang Dipertuan Agong, and the Yang Dipertuan Agong has to accept that particular advice, even in the cases of emergency.
Okay, well, Wei Jiet, I'm sure you've gone through the provisions of the emergency ordinance that's now been gazetted. And I'm wondering, do these powers, in your opinion, go beyond what is required to control the pandemic?
Definitely. So under the emergency proclamations, Parliament is suspended on due 1st of August. Now, Parliament is an important check and balance towards any actions of executive. So it remains to be seen why Parliament, as an important arm of government, has to be suspended during this period. And Parliament is also important because under our constitution, the executive is supposed to table the proclamation of emergency in Parliament, and Parliament has the power to annul that proclamation of emergency. So Parliament is in a catch-22 situation here. They can't convene to annul that particular, or they can't try to annul that proclamation of emergency. So there goes the check and balance towards the executive. Even in the cases of the judiciary, while largely the judiciary is untouched, but as Phillip pointed out just now, your right to property is now being assaulted, so to speak, and normally the assessment for the amount of compensation is done by the courts. Now it's been taken away to a person appointed by the Yang Dipertuan Agong. We don't know who that particular individual is, but the point being that we see glimpses of how the executive is slowly taking away the powers of the legislature and the judiciary and concentrating power exclusively to the Prime Minister and Cabinet here. So I would say it's is a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. You don't really need to have this amount of powers to tackle the pandemic. There's nothing that cannot be done through the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act that warrants an emergency in this particular instance.
Wei Jiet, the leader of the federal opposition, Anwar Ibrahim, has called on MPs to write directly to the king and to plead for him to rescind the emergency. Now, is this extraordinary? I mean, would it be, kind of constitutionally speaking, correct for MPs to ask for the intercession of the monarch in this matter?
I would think eventually it has to be Prime Minister and Cabinet to advise Yang Putong Agong, and I think that what the leader of opposition is attempting is to gain some kind of public momentum and support to pressure the powers that be to advise Yang Putong Agong to shorten or to annul the proclamation of emergency. And I don't see anything that is wrong in that particular move.
Okay, I want to ask you about the duration of an emergency. Is a state of an emergency indefinite? Because in this emergency ordinance, there seems to be no expiry date. Nothing was given in terms of when this ordinance could end. So how easily can we get out of this state of emergency? I understand there's going to be an independent committee that's going to be put together, but we know nothing about who's going to be on this committee.
I believe the Prime Minister announced that the emergency will extend until the 1st of August 2021. As to that particular independent committee, like what Phillip says, it remains to be seen whether it will be truly bipartisan and whether the amount of opposition MPs on that particular committee would be equal to the amount of government MPs. So you're right in the sense that theoretically, the Prime Minister and Cabinet can advise the Prime Minister to extend emergency for an indefinite period of time, but that would surely be detrimental to democracy in Malaysia in general. And we don't know.
Very quickly, Wei Jiet, what are your main concerns? I mean, are your concerns largely hypothetical, theoretical? These are possibilities. Should we just be calm and accept that this government is going to do the best by these laws to deal with the pandemic and be satisfied with that?
No, the harms are not theoretical. Even as we speak now, Parliament is suspended until possibly August. There's no checks and balances to executive. There may be abuses of power that cannot be checked upon by Parliament. Your right to property is being taken away, and that is entrenched under Article 13 of the Constitution. That has been diluted. So we are seeing real practical negative consequences of democracy and human rights in Malaysia as we speak, and we do not know whether that particular trend will continue. And it looks like it will continue in the foreseeable future.
Right. Wei Jiet, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your time tonight. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll come back and have more for you on Consider This. Stay tuned.
Impian Malaysia, setiap satunya penuh bermakna. Setiap langkah mencabar potensi, pasti direalisasikan. Di sebalik impian ada pendorongnya, bukan hanya pelatih, pembimbing, pengarah dan pencerita, malah penonton drama di mana jua. Fanatik sukan, tak kira apa skrinnya. Kaki filem, tak pasti nak tonton apa. Peminat siri, layan tak kira masa. Penggemar rancangan, menonton berulang-ulang kali pula. Ya, setiap suka, tangisan dan tawa anda membawa kebahagiaan. Setiap sokongan anda mencana cita-cita.
Terima kasih. Nandri. 谢谢.
Terima kasih.
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
I'm gonna make him an offer again with you.
You know my father. Men are coming here to kill him.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Loyal to my father for years.
And you give your loyalty to a Jew before you are
set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3
Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Now, yesterday on the show, we spoke to Elizabeth Wong. She's the Assembly person for Bukit Lanjan. And on the show, she raised the issue of whether state assemblies are automatically suspended with the emergency declaration. So let's pick up on that issue and ask Selangor State Exco, Datuk Teng Khim. He's also the former Speaker of the Selangor Assembly and chairperson for the Committee on State Investment, Industry and Commerce and SMEs. Khim, thank you for joining us on the show tonight. Now, there seems to be differing views on whether state assemblies can convene at this point in time. What is the Selangor government's position on this?
Yes, thank you for having me. In fact, if we look at the ordinance, Section 15B says that the Yang di-Pertuan Agong shall have the power to summon, prorogue, dissolve the State Assembly after consultation with the Sultan, the rulers or the governors. So, in fact, although the Assembly is being suspended under the ordinance, but under Section 15B, the Yang di-Pertuan Agong still can summon the meeting of the Assembly.
Chang, what does that mean in in practice? Will the Assembly, the Selangor State Assembly, convene in order to do government business, make laws?
Well, in fact, if you look at Section 11B of the ordinance, it says that the executive power still lies with the state government under the Menteri Besar. So, as far as the day-to-day administration is concerned, the executive is still working as usual, but in terms of the sitting assembly, it's been suspended, and under normal circumstances, the state will seek the Sultan to summon for the session meeting. But under the ordinance, only Yang di-Pertuan Agong now can summon the meeting of the state assembly. And if after consultation with the Sultan finds that it is necessary to summon for the meeting, then it will be done. Of course, when the ordinance says that Yang di-Pertuan Agong will consult Sultan, which means that of course Sultan, I believe, will seek the opinion from the Menteri Besar whether assembly sitting is needed. So, which means the Yang di-Pertuan Agong will have to take into consideration the situations of the country, and then if they think that it is necessary to allow the sitting of the assembly, then he will consult the Sultan, and of course the Sultan will seek the opinion from the Menteri Besar. So I think that is how the thing should do.
Chang Khim, in a practical sense, can state governments turn down or deny any kind of request coming from the federal at this point in time? If there is a need for federal government to commandeer state property, state assets, is that something that state governments can say no to?
In fact, what happened now, if you look at the wordings of the ordinance, it is talking about the temporary possessions of property by the federal government. And the ordinance, the preamble of the ordinance is clear that the emergency is because of the COVID. So it has to be something related to COVID-19 situation. If this is a temporary possessions of property for purpose other than what is stated in the ordinance, I would say that it can be challenged in court. It is not a situation of acquisition. This is not an acquisition, a compulsory acquisition. It's only meant for temporary possession. So it has to be related to the purpose why this emergency ordinance is proclaimed.
Chang, one of the issues, of course, is compensation, and lawyers have raised the question of whether there will be just and adequate compensation, because the reference now is no longer the courts, but a committee set up by the monarch. Do you think that this will have any impact on foreign investors, or even domestic investors in the economy? Will they see this move as being anti-business, and harsh in its framing?
Well, the whole purpose of the proclamation is because to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. So even if there is any actions by the government to take temporary possessions of land, building, or movable properties, it has to be related to the fight against the pandemic. So I do not believe that the power will be abused to the extent that private property, which is not concerned or not related to the pandemic, will be taken possessions by the government. And these possessions, the compensation is only related to the use of the land, building, or movable property temporarily possessed by the government. It is not acquisitions like the Acquisition Act, where the government can compulsory acquire the property and pay the compensation. This compensation is related only to the use of it. And the ordinance says that it will be assessed by the person authorized, the Yang Persatuan Agong, which means I would believe that the Yang Persatuan Agong will use the wisdom to appoint the valuation department rather than civil servants who are not related to evaluation.
Okay, so are there any red flags for you in terms of governance and accountability under this state of emergency? I'm wondering, are you going to find it difficult for you to carry out your work in terms of state governance?
In fact, the ordinance is quite clear. The power of executive is still in the hand of the state government as far as state is concerned. And for example, we have already convened our first Exco meeting for the year on 13th of January, which is 2 days after the proclamation. Everything run as usual, unless we are required to do something, perhaps because of the urgencies of the matter. Perhaps we have to legislate or do make some subsidiary legislation, which may be required. We don't know so far. But as far as we are concerned, up to now, there is no disruptions to the administration of the state government.
Okay, thank you so much, Chang, for joining us on the show tonight. We appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.